I was born in Paris, the youngest child of Pierre and Suzanne Nathan, two French Jews who owned a small bookstore. I was named Florence Louise. We had a decent life in Paris, but my parents wanted to give us a better life, free of the war and cultural persecution they had recently survived, so they brought us to America. I was 5 when we arrived in San Francisco. I didn't speak a word of English when I first walked into kindergarten, and they paired me with another little girl who taught me the ropes, such as they are for 5-year-olds. I learned fast. I did okay in school, I survived my childhood, and I made it through to adolescence. That's when things got dicey. My dad helped quiet my adolescent angst by teaching me photography and bringing me to his commercial darkroom where he and a partner printed photographic murals for the restaurants at Fisherman's Wharf. In junior high, I tried to expand my social circle, but that only made my parents stricter. By the time I was 13 or so, I had a very short list of how I was permitted to spend my free time, and I was awkward and socially inept. Then I went to college on a drama scholarship. I was only 16 years old, but I didn't look it, so I found myself in awkward situations at parties with 19 and 20-year-olds. In the last few months before I turned a liberating 18, the coffee houses and little theaters of Sausalito and San Francisco's North Beach were an antidote to my straight and humorless life with my parents. I carried a big guitar around North Beach for a while, and I entertained audiences at the Coffee Gallery's open mic night by singing Bob Dylan songs I'd translated into French. Trouble was, I had absolutely no talent as a singer. My fortunes changed dramatically when I met legendary DJ Big Daddy Tom Donahue, seen here with Phil Spector. Tom offered me a job at his small label, Autumn Records, which enabled me to move away from home, and he assigned me to work backstage at the rock concerts he promoted, where I was able to first photograph the music scene. Here's David Crosby in 1965 when he was in the Byrds, and Bobby Freeman, whose dance record, Come On and Swim, was a hit for Autumn Records. And here's Sylvester Stewart, the engineer and producer for Autumn Records. Some years later, he transformed himself into Sly Stone. Although I met the Dead briefly in November of 1965 when Donahue brought them in for an audition, it was at the Muir Beach acid test that I connected with Phil Lesh in a way that would forever alter my life's direction. After we'd been seeing each other for a month, the band abruptly moved to LA with Owsley Stanley, maker of the purest LSD to be found. When Phil asked me to join him there, I dropped everything and I went. It was in LA that I took my very first photo of the Dead as they played for the Pico acid test in March at the seriously utilitarian Carthay Studios. Hundreds of photos, and 43 years later, I wrote and published a memoir of those magical years in digital form, featuring 200 of the photos and 10 years of the stories behind them. It's called Dancing with the Dead, a Photographic Memoir, a reference to the fact that I danced on stage with the band for a number of years, but also to the life dance that I shared with them and continue to share to this very day.
Hey, so we're live here, and this is Rosie McGee.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here, share my photos with you.
Yeah, she's written this book, and what took you so long anyway? It's like a great book, and I love photo journals, so, you know, you got
Well, I never intended to write a book originally, but I had all these photographs that I'd taken, and over the years they were used in many books, and I wanted to compile them. Once I had digitized them, I wanted to compile them and share them and put them all together. So I wanted to do a photo book at one point. But then people started talking to me about the stories. You know, I've always, you know me, you've known me for years. I love to talk, and I love to tell stories, and people say, oh, you got to write a book, you got to write a book. And no, I don't think so, I don't think so. Well, over time, it prevailed, and I did, and I wrote a book.
And was it fun? I know
Writing
that,
the book?
Yeah, yeah.
In moments, yeah.
A
It was
lot
fun.
of work, but I mean the whole nostalgic aspect of it. I've done a couple of retrospective writings, and you have to do research and talk to people and make sure you get your facts right.
Well, a memoir is a different thing. You go kind of dumpster diving, you know. You go into your memories, and people have, I'd never kept journals, and people have asked me, well, how did you remember all that stuff? There's 60,000 words of 10 years of stories in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that your memory, there's so much more than you would believe that's all in there. And the deeper you go, the more comes up, and the more comes up, and the more comes up. And so it was fun. It got to be fun, but at first it was agonizing, and I almost didn't do it. There were a few times where I just thought, I can't do this, because obviously we're talking about a long time ago, and there's a lot of emotional stuff that comes up. It's a memoir. It's an intimate memoir. It's not salacious or anything, which some people regret, you know.
Right.
I mean, you know, there is definitely the drugs and sex. I mean, because that
Free
was
love,
part of
yeah,
it. Free
it was part
love.
of it, yeah. So one of the things that I've found into delving into memories is that if you find a kernel of an event, other things pop up, things that, you know, you didn't really remember. I mean, I've like, you know, started to put together pieces, mm-hmm. and then all of a sudden other pieces pop up, and, you know, it's like, wow, light bulb. I had completely forgotten about that. Did you find that in going back and doing this?
Yeah, and there was a lot of times, or not a lot of times. There were some times where I remembered the stories. First of all, in this book, I made it a plan to only write about that which I personally witnessed. And unlike some books, which have a lot of hearsay, there's maybe 3 or 4 stories in this book that are hearsay, but they came from an unimpeachable source. And so I said, okay, these were important, I'm going to leave them in. But everything else is what I remember. And that's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography. A memoir is what you remember. So the content of the stories, I definitely remember in a lot of detail. And if they're, after the stories had emerged, then I checked with people about the chronology. I did do some research as if it was a historical thing, because I know that the history of the Grateful Dead and the San Francisco music scene is so, there's so many details and so many people who are very specific, and they, oh, well, no, wait a minute, that happened on September 13th, not the 14th. And,
it's pretty well documented.
It's pretty well documented,
yeah.
But there's also room for argument, you know. So anyway, I did the best I could. I did get corroborating stories from people where I could, and in some cases I just left stuff out. But it's just my memories.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, because my history with the band started. I saw them in '67 and a lot onward, but I met Ramrod in '69 at Woodstock, and that was the first invite. Come on out to California, it'll be okay.
Yeah, I remember
I bounced back and forth, but what your book did for me was filled in a bunch of gaps in what I knew, and yeah, I think. And I've discussed this with you. One of the coolest things is that I did make it to Mickey's place. Uh-huh. and spent time there, and realizing as I observed the documentation you came up with of what life was like out there, that I felt really fortunate that I had come around in time to catch that. Rosie was one of the first people I became friends with at Alembic, which was the first place I worked at when I came here, and Rosie was like, you did everything.
Yeah, a little bit of everything.
Quick anecdote, and you might not remember this, but maybe you will. We were using Macintosh amplifiers, vacuum tube amplifiers, and I found out subsequently what the military was doing with them was putting them on submarines to drive these like speakers that were out in the water miles away to emulate Russian submarines. So our attack submarines could chase this signal. And I remember we were running these amplifiers for Jack and Phil. The PA was okay. And do you remember the military calling and asking if we would defer an order so that they could get more Macintosh 3500s? I remember you coming out of your desk and saying, wow, the Army or somebody from the Army just called us. Things were interesting back then.
Yeah. I'd like to go back to the book itself.
Yes.
The fact I've been getting a lot, the book has been out since July, and I've been getting a lot of messages and emails about the fact that it's a digital book, it's an e-book, and not in print. And there's a lot to say about that. There's a number of people who are reluctant who've never used a computer or an e-reader to read a book, or they're afraid that the paper books are going to disappear if too many people start reading e-books and all of that. And I'd like to ask you, your experience, wasn't it the first time that you read an e-book?
Yeah,
was
absolutely.
For my book?
And I absolutely loved it. I waited until, because I have been able to read, and I devour books and I can't put them down. That's the way I read.
Right.
So I flew back to the East Coast. I read half of it on the way there, and then a few days later flew back. And it was really cool because you could flip pages really easily, and they didn't flip back. And I read it on an iPad and got to see all the color photos in color, which was really, really, really cool. Go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to make the point that you don't need to have an iPad or an e-reader or a Kindle to read my book, and that's a misconception that a lot of people have. So I want to clarify that for the audience.
Okay,
that you can read it on a PC, on a Mac, on an iPad, on any Android device. If you go to my website, rosiemcgee.com, there's a bunch of choices of where to download the book, depending on which device you want to use to read it. So I just wanted to make that point because at least twice a day I get questions about that. And people say, well, I can't read your book. I don't have a Kindle.
So you can do it on a computer.
So you can read it on a computer. You can read it wherever. First, decide what device you want to read it on, and then you go to Amazon or wherever and download the e-reader app for that, unless you have a Kindle, So anyway, it's on my website. I just wanted to make that point. So let's get looking at some photos.
Sure.
Can we do that?
Yeah. Is it time to?
Ooh,
there we go.
Yeah, there we go. So this is Troopers Hall. It was the first, it was a gig that we were living in LA, and the guys had been sitting around in the living room. We were in this big house with Owsley as our benevolent dictator, I like to call him. And there weren't very many gigs to have. And so they put together this one show at Troopers Hall, and we made $75 at the end of the night, and we spent it all on the munchies. We had the munchies, so we had to go eat, and then we had no money. But we were happy, and we got home. But in San Francisco, the music scene and the ballroom scene was in full flower, and musicians live to play. They want to play music. And see, here they are sitting in this living room in LA, and there's nothing to do but smoke weed, take acid, and play in the living room. Why did Bear do that?
Yeah, why did the band go to LA?
Well, the band originally went to LA to, it's kind of under dispute. Nobody really knows why they went. But the pranksters went to put on some more acid tests, and so the band had been the acid test house band in San Francisco, so they went back down. They went with the pranksters, and by then Owsley had become part of the Grateful Dead scene, and so he says, hey, you know, I'll rent your house, I'll pay all your expenses. He wanted to become their benefactor, their sound man, their who knows what, you know, whatever. And so that's what he did. He rented this big house, but mostly we just sat around and sat around and sat around. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, everybody was having a wild time and, you know, going to the ballrooms and dancing in the park, and the band just said, hey, we got to go. We got to go back. We got to go back. So Melissa, Owsley's girlfriend, and me and I were sent up north with a big wad of money to find a place to rent. And I found a little ad in the newspaper for Olam Poly. And that brings us to some photos that I've got. And yeah. This
cool
photo,
place.
I'd like to stay on this for just a second, is 1920s. It's the Burdell Mansion at Olam Poly in the 1920s. And when we arrived at Olam Poly, as we drew straws for who would get the rooms, which different rooms, because there was about 20 different bedrooms, all different sizes. And Phil and I got the room that's in the picture, the big, huge room with the terrace, upstairs and everything. And Owsley drew straws. He got the tiniest, darkest little hole of a room at the end of the hallway in the servants' quarters, which he wasn't very happy about. So anyway, yeah, so we can move on to other photos, but Olam Poly was idyllic for us, and especially for the band, and these are just different photos from Olam Poly. It was, actually, we were only there for 6 weeks, and that seems, over the years, the legend has grown.
I know, I thought it was years from what I heard.
Yeah, it was a lot cramped into, or shoved into a 6-week period. We had absolutely wonderful time. It was summertime. There was a swimming pool. There was, the band set up some plywood outside, and they could just go outside, bring their instruments out, and plug in and play anytime they wanted. I mean,
that must have been awesome.
Yeah, I mean, for 6 weeks. And then the only time that we left the property was to go into the city to gigs. It
was only 6 weeks?
It was 6 weeks.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it cost us $1,100, and we were there. And, so at the end of that, we moved to a place in Lagunitas where Quicksilver lived down the road, and Big Brother and Janice lived down the road also. So it was like the end of the summer, so we had another idyllic time there. But that was the last place, I think Lagunitas was the last place where the band lived and played in the same place. And it's really an important distinction, because in LA and Olam Poly and Lagunitas, it's just this fluid thing where the guys are woodshedding and they're learning songs and they're improving their chops and all of that, and they have they don't have to get in the car and go to the rehearsal hall and make sure that there's no restraint. It's just like fall out of bed and stay up late and whatever. And of course, the women are doing the laundry and doing the cooking and all that
back
stuff.
Then. Yeah.
Well, no, it wasn't just that. People have asked me about the women's responsibilities or how we looked at it, and we didn't look at it any kind of way. We were a group of people that all lived together, and everybody did what they did. And if something needed done, whoever was available to do that thing did it. Well, musicians were playing music and rehearsing and writing songs and all of that. So
Pretty special situation.
I never thought of it as, oh my God, I'm doing woman's work and I'm really upset about it. You know, what else was I going to do at the time? I wasn't doing anything else. So why not? Why not go to the store?
It's interesting, when I was on with Bobby, I asked him about that transition, leaving Olin Poly, but also then leaving 710, which we'll get to.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And you know, how it affected the music. And his reaction was, because what I thought of, and I've lived in communal situations, and I think it's probably at the core of the band's ability to telegraph intent to each other without saying anything. Having lived together, you become really aware of each other. And my question for him was, well, what was it like when you lived in different places? And what he said was that, you know, there was so much cultivated socially in those times that that was like going to that school, the learn how to know your brother and sister school, and that afterwards we had to have intent to play music because we had to get together and rehearse. And he said that the fundamentals being what they were, that moving on to having more comfort because there was some money and people had their own places, that the rehearsals actually produced more. And it was a surprise to me because I was looking at it as a deficit, you know, that transition to not living together and, hey, pick up the guitar and play.
Do you mean that it was just more concentrated because they were in a rehearsal situation? It's like, okay, we've got 4 hours. We got to get this done or whatever.
Yeah, I did.
And
Bobby seemed to agree with that as well, that it was productive.
Yeah, and so when we moved out of, we moved down into 710, 710 Ashbury. There's the photo on the steps, and it's Danny Rifkin and Jerry and Phil. There wasn't enough sleeping arrangements for all of us. I don't even remember how short a time it was because I've kind of blotted it out, but Phil and I and Jerry and his girlfriend shared a room with a little Chinese screen between us, you know. So it was only a matter of a very short time before one of us had to find a better place. So Phil and I and Bill Kreutzmann, who at the time was also looking for a place. So I found us a place up the hill. And so we weren't living at 710 anymore, but we were there every single day.
Right.
Phil would drive down, or I'd drop him off or whatever, to meet the guys, and they'd all get in Kreutzmann's red Mustang to go to the rehearsal hall at Potrero Hill. And Pigpen would always call shotgun first.
Okay.
He was really good at that. And they'd take off, and then I would go in and pick up the mail and do all of that kind of stuff. So, but at that time, this was still 1966, and that whole year leading to the be-in, January 1967, which we have some photos of that too. That was the community. The Haight-Ashbury was not known by the public. I mean, by the public at large. We were just a large community of friends and neighbors, and we all knew each other. And it's been written about many times. We would get a flatbed truck and do a spontaneous concert in the Panhandle or in the park or whatever. And we would walk up and down the street, and people would be sitting on their steps and, hey, smoke a joint, you know, and you know, it was just this wonderful thing. By then, the big deal was the be-in, and the be-in was a real pivotal moment because without a lot of publicity, it was almost all word of mouth. There came together 20,000 people. Well, it was the first time we all looked around and went, oh my God, look how many of us
There's a
there
lot of
are.
us.
There's a
Holy
lot of us,
cow.
because we didn't know. We were all in these little enclaves, Berkeley, Politicos, and the different North Beach kind of leftover beatniks,
Right,
or
right,
whatever. And we all came together just by word of mouth in this glorious day. And the thing that happened, though, is that Timothy Leary got up on stage and said I don't blame him, the whole thing, but he did. It was a pivotal moment. He got up on stage and he said, turn on, tune in,
and drop out.
And the media was there. Well, the media looked at this was newsworthy. This 20,000 people appeared out of nowhere and had a wonderful time, and so they started writing about come to San Francisco, wear flowers in your hair. This is January of '67.
Right.
So then somebody coined the Summer of Love, and we were doomed.
Kind of the beginning of
It
the
was
end.
the beginning of the end for
Publicity.
us, because throughout that year, more and more kids came with, without any money, without any clue, without any whatever. And, well, the story's been well told and well documented. So by the end of '67, it got ruined. And in October of '67, the Grateful Dead were busted. And here's this photo. This
You're
is
handcuffed.
I'm handcuffed to Bob Weir. That's me.
And he looks happy.
Well, here's the story: is that like I said, we were living. Phil and I were living up the hill, and so I came to the house to pick up my mail like I did every day. And as I was walking up the stairs, I see Sue Swanson in the window waving at me, go back, go back, go back, because the bust was already going on inside. Well, so about an hour, so I got up to the landing and the cops pulled me in and said, are you coming in here? And I said, yeah. So I came in and they arrested me. About an hour later, after they'd looked all through the house and looking for the alleged use of pot, and but they
Evil weed.
the evil weed. Well, they missed about 1.5 pounds that was in almost full sight in the kitchen pantry. But anyway,
Looked like herbs.
About an hour later, finally the wagon shows up to take us to jail, and by then this huge crowd had appeared across the street, and as we're coming down the stairs, they all cheered, and Weir like raised his arm.
One thing I never noticed, because seeing it on the big screen, was on the left of the photo.
Can you show that
Halo,
again?
put the shot up again.
Thank you.
Halo law offices.
Yeah.
I never noticed that before. Did they help, or it was just?
Well, it wasn't that Michael Stepanian and Brian Rohan.
I don't know.
I'm
maybe,
not sure.
Maybe,
yeah,
I don't know.
Because they are the ones. Stepanian's the one that defended us, and in my case, I got my charges dropped during the night because it was entrapment. I wasn't in the building.
They asked you to come in.
Yeah, they asked me to come in.
Right.
But anyway, that particular photo showed up in the first issue of Rolling Stone.
I think we're going to want to run segment 2. Yeah, video 2.
So let's do that. '68 was a great year for the Dead and for me. I took these photos at the Columbia University student strike in New York, during which we were smuggled into the barricaded commons in the back of a bread truck. The stage was a tiny carpeted area, and I was as close to Jerry and little Sunshine Kesey as it looks, with my back right up against one of the buildings. I think this might have been Mickey's first trip back to New York since he joined the band. It was a bit of an odd situation, as some of the audience didn't know the band, and others were more interested in the speeches the music had interrupted. But the guys played a short set and won them over. Then we all left as suddenly as we'd arrived. A few days later, the Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band played a wonderful free concert at the Bandshell in Central Park. It was one of the best and happiest gigs I remember from that whole year, and I had a great time taking pictures that day. It still makes me smile when I see these photos, and it brings it all back. Afterwards, we wandered through the park, enjoying the day. That same year, we all went down to the Newport Pop Festival, where it was Old Home Week with many of our friends, including Ken Kesey, David Crosby, and John Cipollina and David Freiberg of Quicksilver, shown here with his daughter Jessica. I shared a spot on stage right that day with fellow photographer Jim Marshall, and in a few cases, we took nearly identical photos. I've seen one of Jim's very similar to this one of Bill Kreutzmann flashing me a smile. And then there's this exercise in sonic chaos, Jerry and Phil playing feedback with their amps. Personally, I always thought it was much more fun for them than for anyone else who might be listening. Let's just say it wasn't my favorite part of the music. Check out these photos from the days people smoked on planes, fares were cheap, and baggage was free. This is one of my favorite photos I've ever taken of these guys. I took these at the San Diego airport waiting for our return flight. The fare was about $50, round trip. And here's Owsley with Jerry. Note the palm fronds through which I took this stealth photo of Owsley, or as he liked to be called, Bear. Although in his later years he posed more easily for photos at family gatherings, back then he was rabid about not being photographed. Having successfully taken 4 photos of him without his knowledge, I may well lay claim to holding the record. It was that daunting, especially the part about incurring his wrath and a lecture if he caught me.
Okay, we're back. Yeah, taking pictures of Bear.
Oh my goodness.
Crazy.
Yeah. So that all of those photos were taken in 1968. No, and we talked about earlier how the Haight-Ashbury had become overrun and kind of dark and dismal and a little bit scary. And we all moved out of the city as a result. And I forgot what I was going to say, is that the people who were looking for the Summer of Love in 1967, they were a year too late.
Yeah.
It was the year before.
Yeah.
And so by the end of 67, things were pretty bad. And by spring of 1968, we'd all moved out into the various ranches, different places. And the band was traveling more and more, as you saw from those photos. So in early 1969, Mickey Hart found this ranch to rent.
What a magical place it was, too.
And here's a photo. He asked me to come and take pictures of it for him right before he moved in. And there's the barn before anything was done to it. And it was a beautiful property, 14 acres, and it became a family headquarters, which we had all, like we talked about earlier, we had, for a while, we'd lived, it separated, and there was the rehearsal hall and all of that. So we're living in all of these different places in Marin County, pretty much nuclear families, or 2 couples and a few kids and some dogs and all of that, And we got together and we had family barbecues, and we got together as much as we could, but mostly where we got together was at the gigs. And it became more fragmented. It was a different thing. So here Mickey rents this fabulous place. I mean, it was fabulous. It was an old rundown place, a beautiful property though. It had a lot of magic there. And it was large enough and there was enough buildings that people started moving in to all the different little buildings. I mean, I even lived in the pump house or not in the pump house, in a little shed that was next to the pump house, yeah.
Over by the creek there,
After Phil and I broke up, I lived there for a while. But the point is that Mickey's Ranch became a family headquarters once again. And you never knew who was actually living there or just visiting or staying. And then he famously turned the barn into a fine recording studio, and then there was music again.
Right.
So, and there was a place to go play music and to record, and we had a lot of wonderful time there. So,
That's where the
kinda
magic
missed-
picture that was on Live Dead was photographed,
That's
right?
Susela Kreutzmann, formerly Kreutzmann. And yeah, let's look at some of the people. We got some people? Okay, I guess not.
There we go.
There
this
we
was
go.
also the cowboy and, you know,
Oh, the
gunslinger
cowboy
era.
and the gunslinger era. And there's some photos here of the guys on horseback, not just Weir, but there was a point at which the band was hired to play a band of musicians, horse riding musicians in this
Right.
film called Zachariah. And not all of them could ride. In fact, most of them couldn't. So they all came out to Mickey's to take riding lessons with a great, varying degrees of enthusiasm. And they also had the guns. Pigpen was like, he was really into putting on the sidearm, getting on the horse, and posing.
Yeah.
That was like, his
There
thing.
he
There he
is,
is.
yeah.
Yeah, it was like, okay, well, he looked really cool.
Perfect.
I don't know if he'd ever ridden a horse before.
He looks like he has.
And at one point, Jerry was riding, or he was getting back on the horse, and he was on the wrong side of the horse.
Pulled the saddle
And he
off,
pulled
right?
the saddle off, and the horse knocked him down onto a rock where he broke a rib. And he never went to the doctor, and he never told anybody about it. And I think it was Mountain Girl that told me this story just a couple of years ago.
Wow.
But he wasn't real happy about being on a horse at all. But there, horses and dogs and parties and barbecues, and Mickey's Ranch was a very special place.
I always found the gravity there to be really intense. You'd go out there to drop something off and leave
you'd
2
leave
or 3
3 days later.
later. So I learned to have clothes and a toothbrush. But it was magical. Like, Mickey liked having people there.
Yeah.
And Mickey was like just incredibly social about it, embracing, just not crazy partying, but just, like hanging out and eating and, like.
Well, and it wasn't just the Dead. It was Crosby and Stills came up from Crosby was living in Novato at the time. Stills, I don't know where he was coming from. And then later on, Mickey got into world music, and he'd had the Diga rhythm band.
Right, Zakir and
Zakir
all those
Hussain,
guys,
and
yeah.
just there was music everywhere. But you're right, that property during that period was a very intense, magical place, and we
I
had
remember
some
the big
great
rope
times.
swing from that
The
giant
big rope
giant
swing
oak, yeah.
into the creek, and the kids
Yeah.
fell in. Well, so 1969. Oh, and again, the whole time that we were out in 68, 69, when we were out in the county, we would go into the city for gigs all the time, and they still continued to play in the park whenever they could, and we had. It was still the community of Quicksilver and Airplane and Big Brother and all of our friends. We just had a wonderful time. The crew, do we have a picture of the 3 crew guys in Rex? It's 2 different photos. You have that?
I remember, just because everybody was out in Marin when I got out here, and it was kind of like cool, driving into the city.
Oh, yeah.
And it
then
was
we'd
also
come out
really
at dawn.
cool to get out of the
yeah,
city.
it would be at dawn
Back
we'd come out.
There they are.
Yeah, here, I got to say, these guys, the Oregon crew, Grateful Dead's crew, Sonny Hurd, Johnny Hagan, Ramrod, the one and only Ramrod. And I found out just recently that all of these guys met at the Reform School in Lewiston. Was it Lewiston? Hermiston, Oregon.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense if you knew these guys. But regrettably, I also realized that with the passing of Joe Winslow recently, every one of those Oregon guys is gone.
They're all gone, yeah.
So we were blessed to have known them all.
You know, Sonny and I were on the road for a while with Dave Bromberg. I hired him. I went off to, Dave had the Dead play on an album, and there was a connection, and I went off because I could be the tour manager, bus driver, and mix. I don't know why I wanted to wear all those hats, but we got Sonny out there. And here's a cat, you know, these guys were like real cowboys and kind of hard-edged. And we're leaving New York on this trip down south, and Sonny says, drop me off at Zabar's and go in a holding pattern. Sure, and you know, 3 rounds around the block, and there's Sonny with a shopping bag, and I'm driving down the Jersey Turnpike, maybe about, 15, 20 minutes later, we're on the Turnpike, and I look over, he's got like plates, he's got a bottle of wine, we were drinking while we were driving, and crackers, sharp cheddar, smoked oysters, and he's making this picnic. Kind of the opposite of what you'd think,
Think.
in Oregon.
Yeah.
He was, they all had hearts of gold, those boys.
Absolutely. Well, we've got another video coming up here. So through 1969? No? Okay, we don't have a video right now. Okay, so through 1969, the band was away more and more, and they became a hard traveling road band, and the women got left behind more and more because we never had very much money to travel in those days. So, things got dicey and with some people, and by the end of 1969, Phil and I had split up. And that's all chronicled in my book. I don't want to get into it here.
Right.
But things were starting to change. The band had recorded. They had records out. They were getting more well known. They were gone all the time, and
they were traveling pretty lean and mean too, because I followed them around on the East Coast and as
Right.
far as the Midwest a little bit. And I remember being in Cincinnati, and I think Jerry crashed at a house that I had friends at, and he changed guitar strings there. I don't remember. It's just this vague thing.
What, they couldn't afford hotel rooms?
I don't know. There was a party or something.
Oh, okay.
They could, but there was a looseness and
Yeah.
embracing people that weren't going to be threatening. And it was before the giant gigs, and where they were playing shows where they could see to the back of the room and actually see people.
Can we do the video? Any chance? Hello?
Maybe they want us to talk.
No, okay. I thought we had video 3.
They're working on it.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Sorry,
I
guys.
see. Technical issue.
Technical issue.
One of the things I wanted to ask you before we go to Twitter is, you were at the Central Park 68 gig,
Right.
band shell.
Right.
How did you guys like the New York freaks? I mean, it was like Central Park, we had a be-in there not too long after the be-in in California. And it was great for me because it was, wow, we get to do this too. And, then John Cutler and I both lived on 6th Street across the street from each other, didn't know each other, and our first show was that 68 show at the band shell.
Uh-huh.
How'd you guys like Central Park?
What a wonderful crowd. I mean, New Yorkers, what can I say? New Yorkers, Californians, Deadheads, we're all one. But in New York, there's this energy that
Right.
is much more caffeinated, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's wired.
It's wired, and it's deep and it's enthusiastic, where California was always, hey man,
A little more laid back.
more laid back. Yeah.
Well, I've been accused
We had a
of
great time in New York.
New York people, when I go back there, that I've slowed down too much and I couldn't
You've
survive
become
there anymore.
Californiated or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So are we're going to answer some questions?
we'll do some
See, okay,
questions from
let's give it a
Twitter.
shot.
Yeah.
Oh.
How about this? I like this one. Is there a particular song that has stuck with you from back in those early days with the band, or one that really speaks to you?
Oh, there's so many. Yeah, I put it on a piece of paper here because I had a feeling somebody'd ask me that. What I related to, at least the book is a 10-year period, 64 to 74, so I'm sticking with that period because there's, 600 Grateful Dead songs or
It's
something?
scary.
Scary. But in the early days, what I liked to dance to and what moved me, the first one that I danced to was Cold Rain and Snow. At the time, they played it like a lilting thing, and I just was pulled out on stage by it, and nobody stopped me, and that's what started it. Early days, Dancing in the Street, China Cat, I Know You Rider, a lot of rockers. Then it got a little more complicated. I loved the 11 because it was a challenge to dance to.
Yeah, especially when it goes through its metamorphosis.
Well, yeah, and depending how
tempo-wise.
high I was, it was like really, really interesting. And the other one, and then moving along, Bertha. I love Bertha. There's a section of my book, the preface, I talk about going out on stage and dancing to Bertha. Brown Eyed Women, The Wheel, any Dylan song, All Along the Watchtower. Baby Blue, I love that song. I mean, it all to me had to do with dancing, what songs that moved me inside and then sometimes moved me to dance,
Incredible.
literally. Yeah.
One observation that I had back then was there was a time where the audience understood they all couldn't get on the stage. But a few people, myself included, I remember being at a show and sitting on a stage in front of Garcia, just leaning against a wedge, one of the monitors, and people were dancing and having a good time.
What year might that have been? Pretty early.
I think it was 69.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a very casual thing.
Yeah, see, I got an email just yesterday from a woman that asked me about why I thought that she had tried in the late 80s to become a dancer on stage and was, yeah, are you kidding? And she wondered why, if there was a philosophical reason why the band would no longer honor the magic of movement or whatever. She put it something like that. And my answer to her was that she needed to separate out two things. One is the magic of movement and the magic of dance with the music, which, it's the band, the audience, we're all one with the music. The dancers are out there, the band's over here. And the fact that they're a working band that has technical issues and issues with people being on stage for whatever reason. Well, in the super early days, I got away with it because, like you said, you could sit underneath Jerry while he was playing, and he just try not to kick you, and it was like no big deal. And same thing with me. They allowed me. My criteria was don't bump into anything, don't get into the sight lines of the band to each other, don't trip on any plugs, and other than that, go for it.
Yeah.
And they honored that I was compelled to be out there, and it was one of the most wonderful parts of my life, and I did it for a number of years.
Pretty cool.
It was very cool.
Well, I think that people in the audience had a hard time realizing that these guys were working. That
That's a good point.
This is I'm
This
at
is a
work
working
right
band.
now,
Yeah,
and
I'm
I'm
at
in a
work.
work environment, and you understood all of the intricacies of what that environment
Right,
was
what the
and what you had to
limitations
look
were.
out for,
Right.
and you just couldn't let someone just kind of come up and dance around because
Well,
it would have been
also
chaos.
after a while, when the band became more well-known and they went on the road more, there were more and more demands of people wanting to be on stage behind the amps, and it just got out of hand. And so finally the crew just said, you know what, nobody.
Right.
Forget it, nobody. And when I stopped dancing, it was because Jerry didn't have the nerve to ask me himself, or he was too kind or whatever. So he had Phil ask me, please don't do that anymore. Don't come out. You know, things have changed. We can't do that anymore. And I totally understood, and I just felt grateful that I'd been blessed to do it so long.
Yeah, it was magic and a very magical time.
But things, you know, times change.
Changed
Yeah.
tremendously, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about, I have a question from Local Music Vibe on Twitter. How did you get your name?
I know who asked that. Somebody put her up to it. How did I get my name? Yes, I was born Florence Louise Nathan, and I became Rosie McGee in 1970. I had become newly single, and I was staying for a week or so with a Canadian country trio. The James and the Good Brothers had an apartment, and they let me stay there with them. And what they did was sit around and play in the kitchen. You know, they played songs and sang, and they encouraged me to pick up a guitar and sing along. And even though I had no talent as a singer, as I said earlier. So we were sitting around, and they started singing Me and Bobby McGee. And we're smoking a bunch of weed, smoking our brains out. And one of them starts singing Me and Rosie McGee. So we went off on this tangent about Rosie McGee was Bobby's sister, and how come he was busted flat in Baton Rouge and smoking other weed. You know, that's just like, it was just a cloud of pot smoke. But Bruce, one of the Good Brothers, looked at me and says, you should become Rosie McGee. You should be Rosie McGee. And he was just joking. He was just high, you know. And I just went, I think I'll take it. And I took it, and I changed my name, and the rest is history.
Yeah, hit
I mean,
the wall
really,
and stuck.
Yeah, it hit the wall and stuck. Well, it made me happy. It was a happy name. And I wasn't very happy right then. I had just broken up with Phil, and I was kind of unmoored. And so I just changed my name, and then that allowed me to stay within my same scene with a different name. And it, you know, it's hard to explain how that changes things.
It does, though.
But, you know, I didn't want to stay with a name that would forever link me to having been Phil's girlfriend within that same scene. It was like, you know, so I became Rosie McGee, and there you go, Shelley.
But, you know, you have to, I know that, you know, we're all crazy hippies and, you know, free love, and we can share the women and we can share the wine.
Wait, we can share the men, we can share the weed.
Right, that's right, that's right.
You know, it's not one-sided.
But you have to admit that, you know, we really did have something going on. We really allowed each other a lot of latitude. I mean, you know, after you split up with Phil, you still got to hang out and
Well,
be
and to
in
a
the
degree,
family. And
to a degree, I, at least at the beginning, part of it was I think I had some goodwill from all of the other people, but I thank Phil for that, because in a different circumstance, and it did happen to some of the other women once they broke up with somebody, he never treated me with anything after we split up, never treated me with anything but affection and respect, and as far as I know, never talked me down to anybody over the years. And that's an adult thing to do.
Pretty
and
darn
it's the way it
adult,
should
yeah.
be.
Yeah.
But it's not the way that it was for a lot of people. And there are many cases of women who broke up, and it felt like they were shunned. You know, it's like, okay, I'm going to skulk out of here now.
Yeah.
But don't know. I loved the people in that scene. I loved that scene and my place in it, and there was no way I was going to leave. And so it took a little adjusting. I went to work for Alembic, and I was still around all the time. Well, that's where we met.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank goodness you were at Alembic. You were my first friend there, other than Ron, who's back there. Yeah, it was really magical times.
So let's take another question.
Yeah.
This one's from Mike Murphy on Facebook. What's your best Bob Weir memory?
My best Bob Weir memory. I'm going to have to think about that. Can I pass?
Yeah, we'll go back. I think this one.
It's not a negative thing. Nothing's coming to my mind.
To do.
I can't read from here unless I put.
Ask about the dead at the Playboy Mansion with Hefner,
I
the
wasn't
dosed
there.
coffee pot.
Were you there?
No, I was not.
Rosie, do you still go to shows for their Phil and Friends? Has it brought back the magic like it has for so many of us?
I have not gone to see Further or Phil and Friends. I've seen a number of really good tribute bands and jam bands, and I do go to shows. I love live music, like crazy. I mean, it's part of my life, and I recently became, and people are going to laugh, but I just recently became a new fan of the David Nelson Band, and I hadn't seen him play since 1968 when he was in the New Writers in New York.
Really?
I just hadn't. It just
Wow.
was one of those things. But I found myself at the River Theater in Guerneville dancing with a very young man, and he, very friendly, nice guy, and he asked me, do you know David? And I said, yeah, I've known him a long time. He says, well, how long have you known him? And I said, since he looked like you. And how old are you, by the way? And he said, I'm 17.
Oh, wow.
But there we were, and that's part of what I love about that music and the music, any music, is that it brings the generations together and over dance and enjoyment. So, I mean, there I was. I'm 66. I was dancing with a 17-year-old, and we're both having a great old time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How about, this is another one from Facebook from Jacob. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about your time spent with the dead?
The first thing?
The acid is just come.
I know who did.
Okay.
Okay. How about, okay.
Yeah. The acid is just
The acid
coming
is
on.
just coming on.
Free love, free
Thanks,
love.
Justin. You know what comes to mind when you ask that question is how much I love those guys, loved them, and how blessed I was to be in the middle of that situation with them when I was in my 20s. I mean, everybody remembers if they had good time in their
Right.
20s, but it's kind of you're it's full of energy, you think it'll go on forever, and it was so magical to be there and to be dancing on stage. Dancing on stage was only part of it. I mean, it was a dance of life with them and me, and it still is. And the other thing is how hard they worked. People just, like you said, they're, hey, I'm at work. This is my office. This is my workspace. This is home. Like that. But also, people don't realize or don't give. They must realize, but they don't give thought to how much work it took to become the Grateful Dead and to become. And they're still doing it. To go from where they were in 1966 when I met them to what they became musically, it was work. They worked so hard. And that's the other thing. There was, the love I felt for them and the amount of work that they did.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that they just kind of hung out and the music just happened. People don't understand that the structure, the direction that they were going in, improvisationally, and up until that point in time, the 60s, jazz was really the only thing that embraced improvisation.
That's a really good point, yeah.
And you had men that were journeyman musicians that could play and play off of each other. And the Dead learned that. And, they created a genre which now, how many jam, the word jam band has come
Whatever,
up.
yeah,
It didn't
however you
exist
call it,
then,
yeah.
and Phil was into experimental music. Mickey was exploring Indian music and polyrhythm, and there were all these musical ingredients, and it didn't just happen. They worked their asses off, right? I mean, you saw it all go down.
Well, and here's another point too. Much has been made of the fact that they and the audience were high on psychedelics, especially in the early days, and that drugs were a part of the scene, and that they were on stage making this incredible improvisational music. It added another layer of wildness, to be high. But even without that, to be able, I think it's kind of what you're saying, is that in order to improvise to that degree on the 11 and the complicated music signatures and all of that, you gotta have your chops. You gotta be really good so that you can come back to the one. You can even know what the one is.
Exactly.
And no, that's part.
I mean,
goes back
I just
to how
got
hard they
chills
work.
thinking about that because, those guys had an advantage to knowing each other as family, and there's an intimacy, and the combination of adept musicianship with a foundation of family, I think that they had an advantage over, some of the things the kids now are trying to do, because they're doing it, but I think that the Dead wrote the book and, built the archetype for what's going on right now.
You want to do a few more questions?
Yeah, we can do a few more.
Let's see. As a photographer and music fan, what performers would you want to photograph today?
Well, I never thought of myself as a music photographer, and it's, to me, it's pretty daunting. I have great admiration for the photographers who do concert photography, stage lights, and studio lights, and that kind of thing. It's really, really difficult. And most of the photos that I took were outdoors. There were a few indoor gigs, and then after a while, I gave up. So I considered myself a documentary photographer rather than a music or rock photographer or whatever other labels. I started taking photos when I was 12, and for some reason was compelled to document my life in photographs. So I just took pictures of everything. And so that's how, when I got into the music scene and started living with Phil and with the Dead, I always just had a camera around. It was like a natural thing. And so these photos that you're looking at and that are spread throughout my book, there's about 200 photos in the book covering a 10-year span. They were just taken because I was around with a camera and they were used to me. So I guess photojournalist rather than concert photographer.
Catching moments in time.
Do you still do some photography?
I do photography all the time. Yeah.
In 3 minutes, we're going to be able to run the third movie.
We are?
Yeah.
Cool.
One thing I want to ask you, and I've just started to, and you have the advantage, your dad taught you photography.
Right.
And you had a darkroom at your disposal. My best friend's dad had a wet darkroom. Wet darkroom is when you actually have the chemicals and running water.
When you use film.
Yes.
Film.
And I learned on that, and you will never forget, I'm sure, the first time you saw an image appear on paper. It was one of the most magical moments for me to just watch the image appear in the dark room under the red safe light. And now it's digital.
Well, for me, the first time that I saw that image come in the chemicals was in an 8-foot table.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Where, I showed the photo earlier of my dad with his commercial
the giant
darkroom.
projecting enlarger. Yeah.
So it was a photo of the redwoods.
That's incredible.
A mural that he was in this big bin.
One of the things I've found, and I'm starting to embrace it and love it, is if I'm going out to shoot, I take my laptop with me, because
so you can look at it right away.
Yeah, not on the little LCD, but the instant gratification. And I shot a lot, like rolls and rolls of film. I used to wind my own film and do like 10-shot rolls and just like do one subject and do all 10 shots. Trying different exposures and figure out what worked. But the disconnect between when you did it and when you actually got to see the image was sometimes, for me, months.
Well, yeah, at the very least a week and a half.
Yeah.
And then you never knew exactly what you were going to get.
Right, and then the subject was gone. And the thing that's great about digital now is you're there with the subject, and you have the tools to see if you got the shot.
That was terrible, let's do this.
Yeah.
Can we run the video?
Okay.
All right.
Video 3.
Video 3, let's go.
By the end of 1969, I was again single, trying to assess my old life and find my way to a new one. So when I was presented with an opportunity for a 6-week road adventure in 1970, I jumped at it. It was a cross-country music festival filmmaking odyssey called the Medicine Ball Caravan, and all my North Beach friends, the entire crew of Alembic, and 95 other adventurous souls were going. How could I not go? Masterminded by the one and only Tom Donahue, it was originally planned with the Grateful Dead going along as the house band, but manager John McIntyre wisely pulled the plug on that idea. It was on this adventure that I got to know the Alembic folks, who were providing concert sound and recording, including engineer extraordinaire Ron Wickersham, shown here at the Boulder concert. The director was an eccentric French documentarian named Francois Reichenbach, who was sometimes compelled to do some filming in his red pajamas. There were a lot of tie-dyes on that caravan, including the covers I created for Alembic's sound system speaker cabinets, and 11 tie-dyed 20-foot canvas teepees created by English designer Maureen Titcomb and dyed by a large crew of San Francisco hippies in less than a week. After a month-long adventure crossing the U.S., we all flew to England for a final concert to be filmed on a beautiful estate outside of Canterbury. It featured staggering performances by Pink Floyd, Mott the Hoople, Stoneground, and Rod Stewart, then part of the Faces. After the caravan, I went on to Paris and returned home to be offered a job at Alembic. It wasn't long before I was back in France, this time with the Grateful Dead. The band had been booked for a music festival at a site outside of Paris, with lodging at the 17th century Chateau d'Hérouville. Shown here are the oldest farm buildings on the property. A deluge of a rainstorm forced cancellation of the festival, but the band and crew were already on the plane and didn't hear about it until they landed. While the band went on to the chateau, a couple of crew guys and I stayed to secure the gear. It was several hours before we arrived at the chateau, and we were greeted by applause and a lovely meal in the dining hall. We awoke the next day to a perfect blue sky summer morning with no responsibilities and only 40 miles from Paris. I headed straight for the Eiffel Tower with Hunter, Weir, Kreutzmann, Garcia, and a couple of other people. Despite the fact that the Eiffel Tower is probably the single most crowded location in France during the month of June, it was my pleasure to shepherd the guys on their tour,
pointing out the landmarks of my city from the windy second-floor landing. The only person at Arrowville who seemed to be having a poor time of it was Pigpen, who wasn't feeling well. He stayed to himself most of the time we were there. I tried to get him to come to Paris with us, but he just shook his head and said, "No thanks, think I'll just stay here." The last day before we came home, the crew set up the gear on the lawn outside the chateau, and the band played for the mystified citizens of Arrowville, with a film crew sent from a Paris TV station providing the only significant lighting to be had. While this short trip to France was one of the most memorable of my travels with the band, when I thought about it over the years, my fondest memories were of that visit to the Eiffel Tower. And that brings us to Europe 72, the Dead's 2-month tour during which I was privileged to act as French interpreter, alembic recording crew gopher, and all-around dancing girl. This photo, which appears in black and white on the cover of my book, was taken by Mary Ann Mayer on that tour, and to my mind, it says it all.
Well, I think that's about wrapping it up.
That's about it.
That was really great, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Rosie McGee, rosiemcgee.com, right?
rosiemcgee.com.
You can
Come
learn
and
how
see
to get
me.
the book on your computer, iPad, Kindle, smartphone, or whatever, right?
And you can order prints of some of the photos
Right,
as well.
right.
So come and see me.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Good night, everybody.
The acid is just coming on as I slip through the narrow space between Jerry's amps and find my spot behind him on the stage, far enough to stage right to not block his view of his gear, nor hit him with the sweep of my arms as I dance myself free of my body. The opening chords of Bertha have made it impossible for me to stay seated in the wings on the road case, even with the head-to-toe tingling reminding me that I might soon find it difficult to stay on my feet.
I had a hard run, running from the window.
I had a hard run running from your window. The words dance in front of my eyes, bouncing on the trampoline of Phil's bass lines.
I wonder if you care.
I was all night running, Lord, I wonder if you care. I closed my eyes for a moment and still I see the words, big and bright as fireworks, on the inside of my eyelids.
Run around the corner. Lord, I walk smack into a tree. I had to move.
As I move and sway in place, I feel the full skirt of my favorite gypsy dress anchoring me to the floor with the weight of its fabric against my ankles. A good thing, as in my mind, I'm about to float off into space.
Ran into a rainstorm. Ducked back to a bar door. All night pouring. Lord, but not a drop on me.
I open my eyes and cut myself loose. The music starts to seep in through my pores, seeming to replace my earthly flesh. And my vision is filled with the stage lights bouncing off the faceted rings I've worn for that very reason. That's why, if you please, I am on my bended knees. My heart is beating out of my chest and my hair is flying around my head with wisps of it sticking to my sweaty face. But I don't bother with it. I'm flying, my arms are a blur as they propel me in my swirling dance, and my face may well crack from the smile spread across it. I am as happy and free as I will ever be in this lifetime. I am dancing with the dead.
had to move. That's why, if you please, I am on my bended knees. Bertha, don't you come around here anymore.